Welcome to Open Science in Research Proposals webinar. My name is Eva Savolainen and I work as an information specialist at Aalto University Research Services. Our agenda today consists of two parts. We will talk about the open science requirements of two major research funders, namely Academy of Finland and Horizon Europe, and how these requirements can be considered in research proposals. We'll start with the Academy of Finland and continue to Horizon Europe. And after each section, we will have a short Q&A. Regarding the practicalities of the webinar, this webinar will be recorded, but the Q&A sections will be left out from the recording. I will start with the open science requirements of Academy of Finland. Just a small disclaimer first. This presentation is based on the basic guidelines of the current funding terms of the Academy. If you get funding, you should always check the current requirements and practices regarding open science in your funding terms appending to your funding decision. Current and previous funding terms can be found in Academy of Finland website. The Academy has policies regarding open science, regarding scientific publications, data, research methods, and research output metadata. Let's have a look at scientific publications first. As for peer-reviewed scientific articles, Academy of Finland requires that they must be opened immediately after publishing according to Plan S principles and Finland's national policy for open access to scholarly publications. This immediate open access requirement can be implemented in three ways. You can firstly publish your article in a Plan S compliant scientific journal. And here I have a link to Journal Checker tool where you can check the compliance of journals. Another way to make the article open is to publish it in a repository that is compliant with Plan S. And here the Academy of Finland has a small exception to immediate open access, namely if the publisher refuses immediate self-archiving, embargoes are allowed. 12 months for social sciences and humanities and 6 months for other fields. And the third way to publish the article in the way Academy of Finland wants it is to publish it in a scientific journal supported by transformative agreement or in a transformative journal. And transformative agreements here refer to agreements between publishers that are committed to promoting immediate open access and a representative of a scientific community, for example, Finalib Consortium in Finland, or a university. And there's one more requirement regarding peer-reviewed articles, namely they should not be published using the so-called hybrid model. What comes to other scientific publications, the Academy urges researchers to publish their conference articles and monographs with open access, but this is not a requirement. It's good to bear in mind that publishing open access alone is not enough, but the scientific publications should always be archived in a repository that guarantees long-term storage and free open access. For example, university repository or a discipline-specific repository. As a rule, the Academy requires the use of CC BY license, and this applies also to self-archiving. But also some other licenses, such as CC BY Share Alike, are allowed. And now we will move on to openness of data. Here are the general requirements. So the research data should be managed and made available following the FAIR principles, where F stands for findable, A accessible, I interoperable, and R reusable. Funded projects are also requested to submit a data management plan before the funding can be accepted. And here are the requirements regarding opening the data. Research data must be made available as soon as possible after the results have been published via a national or international archive. However, data does not need to be opened if there is a justified reason for that. For example, if data contains trade secrets or personal data. Publishing the data should never be in breach of the Finnish legislation, for example, copyright law. And when you make the data openly available, you should always consider licensing issues. And here I want to highlight the Open Data Directive, which is implemented in Finland with the national law laki julkisin varoin tuotettujen tutkimusaineistojen uudelleenkäytöstä. That requires that data produced in publicly funded research projects must be opened with a CC BY or similar. And finally, if the research data cannot be made openly available, the metadata should be stored in a Finnish or international data finder. For example, Aalto Current Research Information System, ACRIS, in Aalto University. And this is how the dataset metadata can look like in ACRIS and research.fi, which is the national research portal of Finland. You have the information on the data, but not the actual data here. And finally, just a couple of words about the research methods and research output metadata. The Academy of Finland requires open access to research methods where possible. However, they do not have any practical guidance on the implementation yet. As for research output metadata, all research output should indicate that research was conducted by the funding from the Academy of Finland along with appropriate decision numbers. And this information should be added to the publication's metadata. In practice, if you make sure that your article metadata contains a sentence like this work was supported by the Academy of Finland under grant this and that, it should be enough. For example, at Aalto University, research services will take care of the rest. So they will make sure that this information is added to the publication metadata. And libraries, university libraries in other organizations often do the same. That was it about the general requirements. And now I will give the floor to David.
All right, so afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Eva, for your very nice introduction. So I'm a grant writer in the pre-award team in the Research Services Unit at Aalto University, and now I'm going to give some guidance on sections of proposals to the Academy of Finland that deal with open science practices and research data management. Okay, so open science is a movement to make scientific research, data, and methods widely available for reuse. There are good reasons for doing this. So you've heard that it's required by law. It's also a good idea to do that from a career point of view because of the open science citation advantage, meaning that research outputs that are open science are typically more readily cited. And also many disciplines in science are going through a replication crisis at the moment where it's quite difficult to reproduce research findings, and open science practices are one possible solution to that problem. And many funders also require that you commit to open science practices. And that's the case for the Academy of Finland. So the Academy of Finland expects that research outputs that results from Academy of Finland funded research projects are open access by default. And the Academy Science Policy states that implementing the goals of open science is a key element of responsible research. And you can read more about the Academy's open science policies on their webpage. So for the Academy, open science is responsible science. And this is dealt with in the research proposal. You have to outline your commitments and to open science and responsible science in general. So from the Academy's perspective, responsible science includes open access to research outputs, data management, research ethics, equality and non-discrimination, and sustainable development. And today we're dealing with open science or open access to research publications mainly, and data management. And the Academy of Finland has provided quite detailed information on their website. You can read about their open science policies, what they consider to be open access to scientific publications, data management and openness, or openness of research methods and research output metadata. Okay. So the Academy of Finland has multiple funding instruments that range from academy projects to flagships. And these instruments target individual researchers or research teams or research organizations. But in almost all cases, applicants should outline their commitment to open science practices. So how do you do that in practice? So right now we could consider the open science practices from the perspective of the reviewer of your proposal. So the Academy states on their webpage that promoting open science is one of the scientific policy factors that they have identified as a criteria for their funding decisions. So it's a little bit cryptic at this, but they do indicate that they are committed to open science and they expect you to be as well. The promotion of open science and research is also part of their considerations of researcher merits. So this is perhaps underappreciated by many applicants, but your commitment to open science and your demonstration of your commitment to open science in the past is part of your merits as a researcher. All right, so the Academy of Finland provides guidelines for the reviewers of your proposal, and you can read these. These are open and public, and there are multiple review forms. These change from year to year, so it's good to always check and look for the most recent review form for the instrument you're targeting. So here's an example. This is a review form for reviewers of the Academy Research Fellowships last year. So in this review form, the reviewers are asked to evaluate the competence of the applicant, the quality of the research plan, the implementation of the research plan, and each of these categories gets a sub-rating of 1 to 6 here. The reviewers are also asked to evaluate the responsible science, societal effects, and impact of the research plan, and open science considerations are under this responsible science section here in 4.1. So this section does not receive a direct numerical rating. However, it's likely that any issues that the reviewers flag in your descriptions of open science commitments might be raised here in the section 5, where the reviewers should summarize weaknesses of the proposal. So you can see here they're asked to consider different aspects of responsible science, which includes open access to research publications, data management, and open access to data. And if there are any issues with this, they're asked typically to comment on it in these sections. Then the reviewers are asked to make an overall rating for your proposal from 1 to 6 also. And be aware that this overall rating is not a mathematical average of sections 1 to 3 here. And it's likely and possible that the numerical grade that you receive in the end is indirectly influenced by open science considerations. Okay, and here is a link to the reviewer forums on the Academy's webpage. So now let's have a look at the sections of proposals where you might be expected to outline your commitment to open science practices. So, of course, the research plans themselves have a responsible science section. The number varies from proposal to proposal, but typically it's from instrument to instrument, but typically it's under the responsible science section. Your methodology section should also be written in a way that the practices you outline are consistent and aligned with the descriptions that you have given in the responsible science section. So also open science practices should be taken into consideration when writing the methodology section. In Academy of Finland proposals, you are asked to complete a series of electronic forms on the online services. For example, open science practice descriptions and justifications could be given in the budget section, in mobility descriptions, also in your CV, and in some implements like the Academy Research Fellowship. You could outline open science merits and competencies in open science practices that you are planning on gaining. All right, so let's go through these sections in a little bit more detail. So right now we are not considering all of responsible science, but just open access to research publications and data management. So in the open access section of the responsible science section, you could, for example, outline a publication plan. You could indicate expected topics, delivery date, the publishing license that you're going to use. You heard a little bit about that from Eva, and the targeted journals. You could indicate the size of research support for open access publishing. You cannot use hybrid models, as you've heard, but gold open access publishing through library services and self-archiving possibilities, for example, through ACRIS, would be good to indicate. If you have space for it, you could consider presenting the publication plan as a table. You could mention key conferences or meetings and plans to make research outputs open access in other ways apart from publishing in typical traditional journals. You could consider key non-academic stakeholders and communication channels for making and disseminating your research outputs, social media, press releases, trade shows, and so on, whatever might be appropriate. You should indicate that you're going to make the data generated during the project open. You could indicate the schedule for making the data open access. Now, you could think immediate after the paper after your publication is published, and at least not just after the project ends. So this can be problematic because the researchers that are employed in the project might be around anymore to make data open access. So I think a high quality plan should take into account who and when and how the data is going to be made open access. The Academy likes you to consider, even though there are no specific guidelines on this, they like you to consider how you're going to make your research methods open access. It depends on your field. Public repository might be appropriate, for example, GitHub. You could publish the method in a traditional journal. You could include your methods on your group's web page and maybe even social media. I'm not sure. But at least you should have a plan for making your research methods open access. The Academy of Finland proposal research plans for their proposals expect you to have a brief plan for data management. So it's not a good idea to say that you'll prepare this later, but rather you should actually have a brief plan included in the responsible science section. So you should describe the type and nature of data that you will collect. You should indicate that you're committed to collecting the data according to fair data principles. And then the data you generate should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. You should indicate how the data will be stored and where during the project. Will there be legal or ethical issues related to data distribution that need to be resolved, and how you will resolve them? And how, where, and when the data will be made available. So your data plan could account for these issues. So just to go through the fair data principles in a little more detail. So the data you generate should be findable. You can consider using persistent and unique identifiers, for example, digital object identifiers, DOIs, and you could consider using trusted repositories, Zendo or GenBank, for example, they could be used. And be specific as you can to convince the reviewers that you have thought this through and that you've got a high quality plan. You could consider how you're going to make the data open access, what the timeline is. Do you have legal or ethical considerations that might prevent you from making the data open access, or if you need to take that into account in the timeline? And do remember that your data, while expected to be open access, does not necessarily need to be so, but you should justify why not. So your data can be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary, depending on your project. The data should be interoperable, meaning that you should use standards for formats and vocabularies for data and metadata that are easily used by other researchers. Your data should be reusable. You can consider what types of data, what licenses you're using for data sharing. Creative Commons licenses you heard a little bit about in Ava's presentation, for example. And you should consider how widely available the tools, softwares, and models that you've used to generate your data are to other researchers. Okay, so let's talk now a little bit about the plan for data management. So if you will collect personal or sensitive data, you must consider how it will be stored, handled, and shared, and that should be done in compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, and also possibly Finnish Data Protection Act. Aalto University has a data protection officer who handles this if you do need at some point to get expert advice. You should consider what type of repository you will store anonymized data that has a long-term value. For example, the Finnish Social Science Data Archive, Zendo, or the Aalto Research Platform could be good choices. All research results generated in externally funded research projects belong to Aalto University, and you could indicate that if you wish. But before publishing or opening up data, you should ensure that relevant issues about intellectual property rights, copyright, or ownership agreements are considered. And if you do have specific questions on data management or data management plans, we have a place where you can ask for expert advice. And there's also information available on Aalto University web pages. Okay, so that was open science practices and where to describe them in the research plan. However, applicants are also expected to complete electronic forms on the online services. And there are multiple places where open science practices could be relevant. For example, in your budget justifications, Open science is not necessarily cheap to do for everyone. For example, archived anonymized personal data is costly and time-consuming, and you could budget for that. However, there are some ineligible costs. For example, costs associated with storing and sharing research data and material are regarded by the Academy as being covered by project overheads, and therefore ineligible. However, the Academy does indicate that such costs can be acceptable as research costs if properly justified. Likewise, the cost of making peer-reviewed articles open access should come from overheads of the sites of research, according to the Academy, and it's not a good idea to budget costs for making your articles therefore open access. The Academy does indicate that the layout and editing costs related to the preparation of publications are eligible. Okay, so do consider the cost of doing open science in preparing your budget, and consult with your financial controller if you're unsure. Another form where open science practices could be taken into account are the mobility descriptions. So will research outputs generated during mobility periods align with Academy policy? You should think about that when you're planning a research visit to another institute. Will the data and results that you jointly develop with another researcher from a partner university or a third party be open at the end of the mobility period? It's probably a good idea before making any agreement that you discuss these issues with your partner. So consider adding open science commitments to mobility descriptions, but also possibly to invitation letter drafts if that seems like a relevant issue to address. For example, IPO rights, copyright ownership should be considered before mobility periods. One other very important form where you should consider open science practices is your CV. So the CV that the Academy of Finland uses is based on the TENK format, and the Academy's version of that format includes open science merits in the scientific and social impact section. So in this section, you can describe how you have promoted open science and research, for example, in the production and distribution of research materials and data sets. So this is a researcher merit. So by demonstrating past commitment to open science, you're showing that you have expertise in this and you're committed to open science practices. Open science can also be relevant in teaching, and it is possible in the Academy's CV format to list open access teaching material as well. So do consider these merits when preparing your CV for the Academy. For Academy Research Fellowship applications, past achievements with relevance to open science could be listed in the merit and increased competency section, but also your plans for gaining competency in open science practices could also be listed in this section. Then one word here about DORA. So this is the Declaration on Research Assessment. And this assessment basically recommends that funders disregard the journal impact factor when considering merits of when considering researcher merits. So the Academy of Finland has adopted this and does not allow researchers to report journal impact factors when making such description in their CV. So I think it's quite a good idea now not to over-rely on research publications, citations, and researcher metrics as an indicator of researcher quality, and instead try to be a little bit more broad and consider other merits that you might have, and for example, in open science. So how many times has your data set been downloaded, for example? How many people have looked at your YouTube videos? Or how many people have looked at your social media? These are also researcher merits that go beyond the impact that your scientific publications have had. So when you're preparing your CV, please do take into account open science practices and the impact that they might have had. Okay, then I'd like to finish by just going through what your data management plan could look like, taking into account these principles. So just to summarize here at the beginning, we've indicated commitments to data management guidelines and procedures. And this particular data management plan takes into account the GDPR issues around the collection of personal data. So the data will be stored on Aalto servers. It's only accessible to group members, and data is secured by VPN file transfer, and will only be transferred when archiving selected anonymized data. Here we indicate that Aalto University owns the data and what will happen during periods of mobility and third-party exchange. And here is a description of how mobility periods and cooperation will be taken into account and how this would affect compliance with GDPR. And in the final paragraph here, we're talking about how the data will be opened, how the legal services may be involved, how the data will be released, and it's going to be anonymized prior to release, and how the data outputs will be made public. So it's going to be done through ACRIS, and it's done to improve the findability and visibility of this data. And here in the end, you can see the Creative Commons license associated with this anonymized data. So this data management plan takes into account many of the issues we've already dealt with, but your data management plan will depend very much on your discipline and the research plan. And it is a very good idea that your open science commitments and data management plans are tailored to your research plan, that the two of them align with one another. Okay. Then, thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I think now we should take them.
So next segment is about Horizon Europe. So I'll start briefly with the requirements, and then Gundaf will talk about how to incorporate those elements into your proposal. So I'm Antti Rousi, and I work as a data advisor, but I do coordination of mostly with different teams, and I coordinate the team of data agents here at Aalto. So I'll give you a brief overview on Horizon Europe open science requirements first. So I think, to me, what first comes to mind with regards to these the Horizon Europe open science requirements, that they're kind of the state of art, and they're kind of a map. I think they're kind of like something that's they're in the forefront of this movement, and we can kind of see where the open science practice are headed. So basically, in terms of the new annotated model grant agreement that was released in April, there's two types of requirements. There's additional applications and there's mandatory in all calls. So to my understanding, that Horizon Europe what has changed within April is that they took the practices that were previously recommendation, and then they turned them into additional applications in some of the calls, kind of, I think, emphasizing the fact that these are part of the agreements more. Instead of having mere recommendations, they are now often more included in the grant agreements themselves, kind of emphasizing their importance. And I would kind of argue that even though this might not be all of these might not be part of your grant agreement, they're still very interesting, and they're worth studying what they mean and how do they work. So, for example, the first one, which is an additional application, is early and open sharing of research. So Many of you is probably familiar with preprints, like posting the submitted version of your work to, for example, archive, like with the national license, that's done a lot. And I think they want to broaden the kind of fields that use this practice and brings a lot more to than just claiming your idea. For example, now there's the pre-review service where you can get reviews, like public reviews for your preprints, so you get additional reviews which can be kind of argued that improve the quality of the paper. So pre-review service is very nice. And I want to say about the preprints that, like, be very careful not to publish the preprints with open licenses, as in my notion, for example, the requirements that the open license requirements focus on the final articles instead of the preprints. So we have I'll let you know some materials regarding all of these in a bit where these are explained in depth. So and registered reports are also very interesting. So in that sense, you send the research design or protocol for review first, and then when it gets accepted, then just by following the protocol, then your article will also be accepted. So this is kind of a conceptual model to fight this called publication bias, where only positive research results are being published. So in that sense, like, or that people change their research design after they've seen what the results are. So these are all really interesting kind of movements and relate to the transparency of research. So mandatory practices are, for example, data management plans, measures to ensure the reproducibility of research outputs, and then we have open access to publications, which is the same as kind of the plan as principles. They're a bit different from Horizon Europe to Academy of Finland. There's a slight difference, but I suggest you use the journal checker tool, which was kind of previously described by Eva. And then there's the mandatory to open access to data, mandatory for research data, but with exceptions. And we'll look at those exceptions in a bit. And then there's participation in open peer review, which is an additional application and involving all relevant knowledge actors as additional applications. So you see, I have very little time to go through the open science requirements. Each of these would be a topic for a webinar, of a 45-minute webinar. And so, but I'm kind of happy to say that we are almost nearly there. So there is pretty much a webinar about all these within our YouTube channel. So pre-registration, registry proposals, and preprints and DMPs. So we have pretty much all of these covered. So I suggest you look into those. And as I mentioned, I think these are very interesting to kind of see where the open science field is headed. And I hope even though whether you have an open Horizon Europe grant or not, or you're considering to apply, you would still look into these and see if you find them interesting. So, and of course, as the terminology is quite vague in some ways, like, is it an additional obligation? Is it a recommendation? Is it mandatory in your call? Like the grant officer, if you have gotten a call, then the grant officer is like the safest place to ask. Like, you can consult your grant officer to make sure that you are complying with the terms of your agreement, and that's very important. In my experience, they reply really fast and they're really helpful. So if you're in doubt which of these are if you have a grant and you're in doubt which of these apply to you, then the grant officer and the annotated model grant agreement is the place to go. But for overall kind of information of what these are about, I think we have good materials for you, and I suggest you check them out. So, and as mentioned, the annotated model grant agreement, your grant officer are the places to look for specific details, but just to pinpoint some. So open access is required as a default for research data, but under the principle as open as possible, as close as necessary. And the acceptable exceptions are also kind of explicitly stated in the annotated model grant agreement, for example. And those are the places to look. What I would like to also pinpoint is with regard to open access publishing and open review. If you have not yet heard of this, the journal called Open Research Europe, which I think is quite interesting. So it's offered as an additional publishing option to Horizon Europe beneficiaries. So when that's of course complies with the open access policies, and there's also, I think, the possibility to do open peer review. But these are in short. So as you see, there's quite many, and now I really look forward to Guntav's presentation on how this could be.
All right, so my name is Guindav Garbett. I'm the grant writer for the School of Arts, Design and Architecture and the School of Business at Aalto. And I'm going to talk about writing open science in Horizon Europe consortium projects. So I'm going to focus on the collaborative projects, the consortium projects under Pillar 2, which brings together a large number of topics in the clusters, these 6 clusters in the box here. These are predominantly made up of research and innovation actions and innovation actions, which more or less share a template for the proposal. The principles that I'm talking about and that we've all talked about today are also relevant for Pillar 1 and Pillar 3, but the instruments there all have unique proposal templates, so we can't talk about everything all at once. It just isn't feasible. So that's why we're targeting Pillar 2 here. Now, in Horizon Europe, so we're going to start with how and where open science is evaluated, and that leads you to where you need to write about it and what it is. So in Horizon Europe, open science is a mindset. It's all of these practices, and the idea is that the open and collaborative sharing of information and results and processes and transparency leads to improved excellence in the project and higher quality results. And that's why, if we look at the review form, the primary place that open science is evaluated is in Section 1, excellence. So these proposals are broken into 3 pieces: excellence, impact, and quality and efficiency of implementation. And each of these sections, as seen from the information here, has its own aspects to be taken into account. These are the questions or the aspects that reviewers are told to take into account from the review form. And then each of these sections also has a score from 1 to 5. And there will be a threshold score for each section. So typically, if a proposal scores below, for instance, 3 in any given section, it's not eligible for funding. Now, open science is specifically considered here in excellence. And so a shortcoming or a minor shortcoming identified in your description of the open science practices in excellence could lead to 0.5 of a point or a 1 point reduction in the score for that section. And again, since there's a threshold for each section, it's very important that you score as high as possibly in each section. Now, because of the way open science is expected to be integrated throughout the entire project, it is also going to be relevant to particularly the quality and efficiency of implementation, and then again in impact. So the design of your open science can affect all 3 sections, but as we'll see in a minute, there are specific concerns in excellence and quality and efficiency, and impact is more of an indirect effect. And you should also be aware that there are rules against what's called double penalization. So if you're penalized for flawed open science descriptions in excellence, and that is considered to have an effect on your impact section, they won't then again penalize the impact section because of that. But you also can't describe the open science better in impact and increase your excellence score because they are treated separately in that way. Okay, so to get more of a sense of what's being told to evaluators, what the European Commission is looking for here, we can look at the materials, the briefing materials provided for evaluators. And so here we see that in the excellence section, specifically when assessing the methodology, there are two questions that evaluators are given concerning open science practices. Are the practices implemented as an integral part of the proposed methodology? And is the research data management properly addressed? So right there, you're told that in methodology, you need to address those 2 points very clearly. And when they talk about open science practices, they are talking about the entirety of the practices that Antti just discussed, both the mandatory and the recommended that are now being addressed as additional obligations. So it's important to know in the call, there are some that are mandatory from the grant agreement for all calls, but then the call may have additional requirements. Make sure you know what those additional requirements might be and meet all of them. But if you fail to address the mandatory requirements effectively, your score will be reduced. However, if you adequately address the recommended open science practices, if you engage deeply with these and describe how the recommended or additional obligation practices will improve your outcome, improve your project, that can actually increase your score. So there's 2 parts here to take into account. You have to remember that there's aspects that if you don't discuss the open access publications, the appropriate management of research data in line with FAIR principles, that mandatory stuff, your score goes down. If you do address the other parts, engaging the relevant knowledge actors throughout the process, for instance, using citizen science or participation in open peer review, if you address these aspects, it will actually increase your score. So there is a substantial incentive to engage with those recommended practices. Then in the section on, the quality of the implementation, section 3, there's a piece about assessing the quality of the participants and the consortium as a whole. Now, this section is addressing the capacity of the consortium to carry out the project. So it's interested in research expertise and infrastructures and how the consortium achieves everything. But in addition, or as part of that rather, there is a point where they want to see that the consortium has the expertise in open science practices and in the gender aspects of research and innovation that are appropriate to the actions that have been described in the project. So if you're going to say in your excellence section that you're engaging in citizen science, in implementation, you need to make sure that it's clear which member of the consortium has that expertise. And then, as I said, the impact criterion itself is not directly concerned with open science, but in the European Commission's view, open science is, well, it is directly connected to ensuring that your results are widely disseminated, that the knowledge makes it out of your project and is picked up and used. So here you don't discuss it as such, but the actions that you take in terms of open science will create clear pathways for how your results make it from the project to the audience. So from this, we get a pretty clear picture of where we have to talk about open science. In section 1, excellence in the methodology, which is a specific subsection, you will need about a page describing the open science practices and no more than a page providing a brief research and data management plan. These 2 pieces could be one single subsection of methodology, or they can be separate pieces, but you need this information. In implementation then, under capacity of participants and consortium as a whole, you need to make sure that you also address the consortium's expertise and capacity in open science. And then in impact, in the section measures to maximize impact, which is directly discussing your communication, dissemination, and exploitation plan, the points that you have made previously about your open science practices are relevant. They help illustrate that your plan will be successful, but it's not a direct point of consideration at that in that section. In addition to these pieces of the proposal, the technical description part B, there are also administrative forms. And in the administrative forms, each participating organization can list up to 5 relevant publications, widely used data sets, or other achievements for the entire research team. The listed publications or data sets are expected to be open access, specifically journal articles, and data sets are expected to be fair and as open as possible, as close as necessary. If the publications and data sets are not already open access when you submit the proposal or when you're preparing the proposal, it is strongly advised that you retroactively deposit them so that they are open when the proposal is reviewed. To get away a bit from the use of journal metrics and impact factor, some of the points that David was talking about earlier, these key publications are evaluated based on the qualitative assessment, a 500-character description that the PI gives in the administrative forms. So they're not looking for the impact factor, the metrics here. They're looking for you to explain what is the impact this publication has had on the field, how has it pushed forward science, what was the contribution of the researcher to this. Okay, so now that we know where to write about it, how do we write strong open science sections for Horizon Europe? So in the piece on open science practices, the concern here in methodology is, again, to explain how open science practices contribute to and increase the excellence of the research design and the research outcomes. That's why it's in the excellence section. So they want to see how the open science practices are implemented as part of the methodology of the project. So this is not a communication and outreach plan. There's a specific place for this. This is about the open science in the actual research methodology. What are the methods that you use to achieve your open science? So how do the project's practices increase the chances of achieving the project objectives, and how do they increase the quality of project outputs? So for instance, we've talked about peer reviewing and open peer reviewing, and even the use of preprints, where you might get additional feedback, more information. You're opening the work to the public and getting more feedback from interested parties, and that can increase the quality of the eventual outputs. You do, of course, as I said, need to make sure that you explain clearly how you achieve the required aspects. So the immediate open access publication and the immediate open access to data as appropriate. So here you do want to make sure that you're clear about how you're achieving that. Do you plan to target open science journals? Will you follow a self-archiving pathway? Are there particular platforms that you will use for the archiving? For instance, institutional platforms like the Aalto Research Portal, or the Commission platforms, such as the EU Results Platform, the AI On Demand platform, if that's relevant, Open Research Europe. What are the places that you will archive these to ensure immediate open access to your publications? From there, you also then talk about how open science pushes forward the research through open and cooperative work and systemic sharing of the knowledge tools. And this is where we get more into the recommended, the additional obligation practices, such as early and open sharing of research. What are the appropriate methods of early and open sharing of research for your discipline? Pre-registration, registered report, preprints. Not all of these are appropriate in every case. Pick the one that is useful for your work, that actually gives you valuable feedback, gives you increases the value of the results and the publications produced by this. One thing to think very carefully about here is the measures to ensure reproducibility of research outputs. As David says, reproducibility is an increasing concern in science and research. And so in other parts of the methodology, you are going to talk about reproducibility in the sense of having a very clear methodology, a very clear research design, and addressing how you will deal with negative results, for instance. But you can also address reproducibility through open science practices that ensure transparency of your research. How do you make sure that your tools and your processes are as transparent as possible at every step? How do you use early and open sharing, for instance, pre-registration, to show your research up front, to show your design and deal with negative results, or make your work as transparent as possible? And then, of course, involving all the relevant knowledge actors is a key part of any Horizon Europe proposal. And here you can talk about the ways in which that affects the research methodology itself. Citizen science is a key part here. How do you design the citizen science? What are the channels for collecting information? What are the channels for providing information to the citizens, and the feedback approach, so that the relevant knowledge users can see the science as it's developed and contribute to the science, and ensure that your results are as effective for them as possible. You then have the research and data management place, where you need to explain how you will ensure that your data is as open as possible, as closed as necessary, and managed in line with FAIR principles. So you begin this by identifying the types of data that you're going to produce. You will probably have qualitative data, such as the collection of notes from interviews, perhaps. Quantitative data representing measurements, or the collection of quantitative data from a questionnaire, perhaps. And then you will definitely have project administrative data in the form of reports and budgets and documentation that you'll also need to manage. All of this needs to be managed carefully. And so you want to describe how the data is produced and collected. How will the interview data be collected? Is it through notes? Is it through an audio or video recording? How will that then be processed? How will the questionnaire data be collected and processed? What are the file types and formats that you're going to use for these different types of data to make sure that they are interoperable and and have can be used by other researchers and for your own research. So you continue. One of the easiest ways to structure this section is to simply explain how you are going to make your data fair. And by that, I mean, actually, in this structure down the page, our data will be findable because, and then identify the types of persistent identifiers that you are going to use to mark the data that you have identified you're generating. Where are you going to open and share that data? In field-specific repositories like the Finnish Social Science Data Archive, or general repositories like Zenodo, or in EU repositories that are required by the project. Sometimes the call text will specify that you need to use a repository. Make clear that you will use that. How does it become accessible? And here we want to be careful. You open all the data you can, but some data cannot be opened, and be clear why that isn't. There may be personal information barriers to opening data. the process of anonymization is actually very expensive and cumbersome and may not be achievable depending on how you are collecting the data in the first place. So know whether anonymization is a real goal, or whether you need to state, we can open this data, we will not be able to open other data because of personal information concerns, but we will describe it through metadata so that the data set is known in some effective way. Be clear about what you can and can't do. As David said, also IPR concerns are a valid reason for not being able to open data. Be clear that you will open data after valid IPR considerations are taken into account. How will then the data be interoperable? What standards are you following? What metadata and documentation are you producing to help other people use your data in the future? Or even to just make sure that your data is used properly during the project. And what formats are you using to make sure that data can be reused later? How is it reusable? What licenses do you plan to establish? We typically recommend for most types of research, or for many types of research output, the Creative Commons licenses, but there are various appropriate licenses for different types of output that should be considered. Identify what you might use. And then, like, how will the tools be made available for data generation and reinterpretation and reuse if necessary? So you also in this section want to briefly describe what resources you'll be using to store, access, backup, and transfer the data during the project. This isn't the full DMP, this isn't a huge amount of information, but you want a quick description of how this will take place. If there is a data officer for the project or a particular institution that is in charge of that process, who is responsible for that action? How will the data management and quality assurance be taken care of? And as part of this thought about resources in data management, as David brought up, open science can be expensive. Make sure that you have funds allocated for the appropriate costs. In Horizon Europe, more or less all costs related to open science should be eligible, though that will need to be discussed with controllers and checked with the annotated grant agreement. There's a lot of possibilities there, but there are fewer restrictions than in the Academy structure. So during the project, you can budget personnel months for the data curation and processing. If anonymization is something that you are going to perform, then you can budget the time and cost for performing that activity. Long-term storage of data will also come with a cost, whether it's a deposit cost associated with a repository or the costs of keeping a web page, the project web page available for 10 years to serve as a project results repository for the project. You can also budget the publication costs for ensuring that your projects are published in immediate open access in journals. So all of these can and should be taken into consideration when you're designing the proposal budget, as well as discussed so that it's clear that you have a plan for achieving these actions in the short data management plan. Just to be clear, again, this is a no more than one-page summary. The actual data management plan is a required deliverable in the project that comes by the 6th month of the project and then will be continuously updated throughout the lifetime. So there are two stages, this early DMP and then the official DMP produced during the project. Okay, so then we can talk about the in the section on implementation, the capacity of the consortium in open science. So this is, again, a jump. Previously, we were talking about open science in the excellence section. This is in implementation. And here you want to explain the consortium's expertise and capacity in open science. Again, if you are using citizen science, who has the expertise in that? Where is the track record of open science in this project? Who leads the open science activities? And which other teams might bring key expertise? Discuss also the infrastructure and facilities for achieving the various open science actions that you have outlined above. If the call text specifies a particular platform you need to share, identify if any of the partners have a connection to that platform, have already demonstrated their ability to publish openly in that platform. The section as a whole is about far more than just open science. It's also about the capacity to achieve your research goals and your impact goals, but open science is a key part of the capacity of the consortium. And then finally, in the measures to maximize impact section, this is, again, not a place where open science is specifically evaluated, but the research activities, the open science activities that you take part in clearly create pathways for the wide dissemination of your knowledge, of your project knowledge and project results, for gaining information from the potential users of your results. And all of these contribute to the dissemination activities and achieving the project's impact objectives. So well-described open science makes your planned dissemination and exploitation much clearer and helps the reviewer see the pathways for achieving impact and for getting information from the end results from the consortium to the people who can use it and achieving the impact goals. All right, thank you. And with that, we are happy to take questions.